Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today for our webinar with Randall Hodges. The webinar is presented by Singh-Ray Filters. Hopefully, if you're on the webinar, obviously you've heard of us. Hopefully you are all customers and you love your Singh-Ray filters, and hopefully we can get you using them more and more often. I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Randall Hodges has been capturing images of the Western United States as a full-time professional photographer for over 17 years. Most of his work comes from time spent hiking and backpacking in the wilderness areas where he's hiked and photographed over 26,000 miles. His work has been published over 4,500 times in books, magazines, calendars, postcards, newspapers, and more. He's been in National Geographic, Nature Photographer magazine, travel magazines, the Photo Professionals magazine. He does not alter his work in any way and considers himself an all-in camera shooter. He spends the time to wait for the right light and color and uses old school techniques rather than post-processing to capture his remarkable images. And he's going to go into a lot of that. Some of the photos he's going to show you today, he's going to explain how he had to wait for just the right light, or you know, a lot of these photos you have to be patient if you want to get it done in the camera. Randall said he's in his gallery right now. He has his home base in his gallery, the Randall J Hodges Fine Art Photography Gallery in downtown Edmonds, Washington. And we'll give you a link to his website and contact information at the end of the presentation if you wanted to reach out and learn more about his work. So Randall, without any more delay, I'm just gonna let you take over from here. And you guys, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the question window. I'll be watching for them and I'll let Randall know when they pop up.
Yep, interrupt at any time. And I just want to say welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar here. Also, what she didn't mention there is I do teach lessons and seminars all over the West where I teach my all-in camera style of photography. And there'll be, the last slide will show a little information on how to get a hold of me on that. Like she said, I am an all-in camera shooter. I actually considered myself an old school shooter, as I like to do all the work in the camera, and I do no post-processing at all. And I want to say very importantly to you post-processors out there, I don't do this because I think there's something wrong with post-processing. It actually is kind of the norm in photography these days, and it is expected. I do it for a couple of simple reasons. One, I love instant gratification when I'm out in the field, and I want to use my camera, my filters, and my skills to get it done right there on the spot. And what fuels my spirit and my soul is seeing that finished image right on the back of my camera. I get a whole lot of charge out of people who are standing around me watching me do it and seeing those finished results. And also, to be different, I teach all-in camera photography. Well, most guys out there are teaching out in the field lessons, but a big part of that is in classroom setting doing post-processing. My lessons are completely 100% hands-on out in the field, and I love to see the smile on my students' face when they see their completed image right in the camera. So again, I just stress, I am not against post-processing. I just choose not to do it to be different. And that comes from years spent shooting slide film and transparencies in the olden days, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first image here. And like she said, you can push in your questions whenever you want, and she'll interrupt me when one pertains or fits for what we're doing right now. So on to the first slide.
So before you get started, we do have a general question, and this, you may have multiple cameras, but someone wanted to know, what camera do you use?
Oh, great question there. I use two cameras right now. I'm shooting the Canon 5D Mark III, which I call the image maker. And I am also shooting the Canon 5D SR, the big 50 megapixel camera that I call the image monster. I shoot these two cameras because they have very similar color palettes. And as an in-camera shooter, the sensor tone means everything to me. I did buy the 5D Mark IV and shot that for 3 months and sold it because it did not fit the color palette I expected to see in the back of my camera. The lenses I use, I'll just cover that really quick. All Canon L series lenses. My main lens is the new 24-105 Mark II lens. That shoots 95% of my photos. I also shoot a 16-35 f4 L series lens as my wide angle, a 70-200 f4 for a telephoto, which is my least used lens, and a 100mm macro, which I do use quite often in the spring. And I also use all the Singh-Ray products, circular polarizers, hard and soft stop split graduated neutral density filters, solid filters, and of course a tripod, #1 rule on that. And I prefer a Gitzo tripod, so that is the gear I'm using.
Great.
All right, on to this first slide. This is fall sunset in Mount Adams reflected in Trout Lake in Washington. That was shot this fall season. This is very typical of the type of work I do. And you're going to see all of my camera data there on the right, what I used to shoot this. And the one thing I want to, that you'll hear me say over and over that I'll just try to explain right up front, is I use the in-camera presets in the camera. For a Canon, that would be landscape, standard, portrait, monochrome, etc. For Nikon, it would be similar, but you would add vivid and more vivid. I actually go internally inside those settings and set up the color palette I want, which is to match the old films I used to shoot. So whenever you hear me say digital roll of film, I'm referring to those digital presets I've set up. And this is how I can run my digital camera like it is my old school slide film camera. So we'll talk more about that as we go. This particular shot was shot at f/18. I often shoot very small apertures to create a very big depth of field. I shoot in aperture priority often, and all of these shots pretty much are in aperture priority. This caused a 5.2-second exposure while I darkened it by 2/3 of a stop. I keep my ISO as low as possible. This one was 100. My focal length was 70mm. My white balance, which I control 100% in the camera, was set to 5200 Kelvin or K. And this was my standard roll of film. Now, what I used for filters to pull this image off is a 4-stop hard filter on top, pushed right down to the fall color tree line there. And then I put a 2-stop hard upside down on the bottom, pushed it right up to that fall color tree line reflecting in the water. And after a few exposures, I call it fine tuning or finessing the filters. I got them adjusted to where either they didn't show up or barely show up in the image. And I shot this series of exposures, this one having to be my very favorite one. And I do love color, and this is Alpenglow. So I always never leave a sunset too early. Sometimes when it's almost dark, you might get your very best shot.
And we have 2 people ask, are you shooting RAW or JPEG?
That is a fantastic question, and I will try to answer that. So we can, that'll cover all of these slides. I shoot in RAW, and a lot of people don't think you can affect a RAW file in the camera. That is a bit of a misnomer. You can absolutely affect your RAW file in the camera, but us in-camera shooters have an extra step we have to take. We have to open the RAW file in the software that came with the camera. No other post-processing software can see in-camera work. So I shoot a Canon, and Canon software is Canon DPP, Digital Photo Professional. My whole post-processing is this simple. I do a file open, convert, save as. I convert to a TIFF file because in my gallery, that is my print file. I do then open the photo in Photoshop. I dedust it for sensor dust. I internally keyword the image and put my copyright into it and put all the keywords into it, and then I'm done. Typical workflow for me would be 60 to 90 seconds per image. I hope that answered that question. Just to go a little more into that, to explain it in a little more detail, I love to shoot in camera black and whites. And if I shoot that in my Canon, in my monochrome roll of film or digital preset, and if I open that RAW file in Photoshop, what I'll see is a color photo. That is the raw version of that photo. If I open that photo in Canon Digital Photo Professional, I will see it in the black and white just as I shot it in the camera. Very important step and a great question for us in-camera shooters. And did you have another question on that one, Michelle?
No, that was it. The second question was what software are you using, and you answered that without knowing. So that was great.
Okay, fantastic. We'll move on then. All right, this is Sunrise and Sea Stacks and Surf from Face Rock Beach in Bandon, Oregon. I love shooting sunrise and sunsets on the beach. When I shoot sunrise from the beach, I tend to use less split neutral density filter on the top because we have light, at least on the West Coast, we have light coming up behind us. I can see that the small JPEG file I made this slideshow out of isn't showing the true clarity and quality of this photo. This was shot at f/20. It was a 1/3 of a second exposure, 1/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 28 millimeters on my focal. My white balance was set to 6000K in my landscape roll of film. I had a 1-stop hard pushed right down to the horizon line and a 2-stop soft pushed down a little below the horizon line to blend out that line in the filters. I often will use 2 filters instead of 1 and offset them slightly in order to blend out that line so you cannot see a filter line on this. A little about this particular image, while I was shooting, the quality of the surf was just so. Even though this was shot in winter and it was very cold out, I just sacrificed my boots, jumped in the water so I could get this perspective. I paid the price. The next wave hit me about up to my waist, but I still got out of there with the image I was hoping for. All right, we have any questions on that one?
We do. Michael wants to know, how do you choose the K value to shoot?
Oh, that is with some practice. The best thing you can do when you're out there shooting, when you have your composition set up and everything is set up in your camera, I would try 3 white balance settings. If your camera only runs symbols, I would try sunny, cloudy, and shady. If you can run your camera in K for Kelvin, I would try 5000K, 6000K, and 7000K. If you do this for a lot of compositions in a lot of different lighting situations, you will get to know how the temperature of white balance affects the color palette of your camera. And it's only with some practice that you would get that. With a lot of practice, you just tend to know what I call the sweet spot in the camera is. And I start out shooting my shots at 5600K, and I'll push it a little warmer or hotter, higher in number, or lower or cooler in number, depending on that first shot. And sometimes it takes me 2 or 3 shots to dial in my white balance. And that's a great question.
And then another question regarding this image, why use 2 filters instead of 1 with fewer stops?
Because what I really needed in this exposure was a 2 or 3 stop in hard. And had I used that, you would have seen a filter line through the rocks. So by only using a 1-stop hard and overlaying it with a 2-stop soft, I'm able to blend out that filter line so you cannot see a dark line in the rocks. Another great question.
And then is that also, were you trying to get sort of a different effect in the water than the sky? And does the second filter help you do that?
No, not really. The sky that you see in here really represents what I was seeing with my eye. I was using my shutter speed to try to get the motion in the water that I was more focused on. Once I had the filter balance down, it was all about capturing this. And luckily, I did not have to raise my ISO to do it. 1/3 of a second is really good for me to capture wave motion when it's coming in. So I tend to like to shoot around 1/3 to 1/2 a second when it's coming at me. Had this wave been retreating, I like a little longer shutter speed. I might have gone for a second or 2 full seconds if I could manage it in the light. And so my camera has the ability to drop down to ISO 50. If I'd wanted a longer exposure, that's what I would have done. Or I could have put a full density filter over it to extend that exposure also.
Okay, and then I was going to hold this question for later, but multiple people are asking, What method do you use to secure your filters? Are you holding them by hand? Are you using brackets?
Oh, great question. When I'm shooting sunrise or sunset, I do not use a polarizer. I don't believe it works correctly for the sky at those times of day. So I screw a bracket on there. I prefer a Koken holder with my Singh-Ray filters. So a Koken ring and a Koken holder were on my camera holding those two filters. During the day, when I have a circular polarizer on, I do not like to stack screw filters on another filter, and I use an ultra-thin polarizer which has no threads. So at that point, I'm forced to hand hold my filters over the camera, which I have no problem with. During the day, the shutter speeds are considerably shorter, making it very easy. For sunrise or sunset, they can get very long, making hand hold the filters very difficult or impossible. And believe me, a 20-second filter, when you're holding your breath, trying to hold the filter onto your camera still can feel like 2.5 hours, and you might pass out and die. So for sunrise and sunset, I definitely recommend a holder.
Okay, and then two more related questions. Which two filters specifically were you using, and where did you hold the one-stop filter? Where was it positioned?
Okay, so the one-stop hard was pulled right down to where the sky meets the water. The two-stop filter was blended past that, so it was pulled down to the base of the closest rock in the image.
Okay.
And just one more fine detail about this image that I really like. In the bottom right-hand corner, as that wave is covering the sand and about to hit me, you can see just a touch of shadow of that rock reflecting in the sand while the surf is going over it. I really like that little detail in this image.
And then they wanted to know, did you use a polarizer for the water?
No, I did not. Polarizers do not work well for sunrise or sunset. They kind of give a strange hue or a banding effect in the sky. So there was no polarizer used in this. With fast moving water like this, I'm not sure it would make much of a difference anyway. And I tend, for sunrise and sunsets, want a reflection more than I want to see into the water. So I would tend not to use it for that reason also.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, we'll stick with another beach shot here. This is, I'm sure many people recognize this. This is Haystack Rock and the Needles from Cannon Beach. Pretty simple reflection shot here. The reason I picked this particular image, this is another sunrise, so you're catching that first light out there on the rocks. This was shot at f/20 at 3.2 second exposure with a full stop dark, excuse me there. I tend to darken my photos a little bit. ISO 100, 24 millimeter focal length, white balance 5600K in that landscape roll of film, which is my go-to roll of film most of the time, with a 3-stop hard filter pushed right down to the water line there. The reason I picked this is it's a pretty simple image to attain if you can get a reflection. And on the beach like this, I didn't need to use 2 filters because I had such a good hard line to push that hard filter on. And when I have a good hard line, I prefer to use just one filter because I can get it right on that horizon and make it disappear. Any questions coming through for this guy? All right, we're going to go ahead and move on. So this is one of the images. This is one of the images I did capture while I was shooting the Canon 5D Mark IV, which seemed to perform very well when there was a lot of color in the sky, as in this sunset here. This is Sunset and Sea Stacks from Second Beach in Olympic National Park, Washington. I love the Washington coast. A lot of the beaches are hiker-only beaches. This one is not too long of a hike in, only about a mile. And I shoot a lot of my beaches in the winter, and that's why they're featured for this webinar. This was also a winter shot. This was shot almost coming up on 1 year ago. It was shot around December 20th. f/20, 3.2 second exposure, 1 full stop dark, ISO 100, focal length with 46 millimeters, white balance at 5200K. Again, I'm using my go-to landscape roll of film or digital preset with a simple 2-stop hard right over the top there, pushed right down to that water line. And again, I have a nice straight line there to push that filter down to. And there's so much color reflecting in the sand and light in the sand that I could just go with a 2-stop. Pretty simple exposure, but a very rare sunset. Last year I was out in the field for 147 sunsets. I saw something like this 3 times. So all good photographers tell you, get out in the field a lot, and that will help your chances of getting lucky. Are we getting any questions on this one?
Actually, Bill said, go back a minute, and I'm not sure if he meant the last image or the one before, but he said, what's your reason for stopping down so far?
I shoot in aperture priority, and often I think digital cameras, when I'm doing a center-weighted, an evaluated metering, and it's metering the whole scene, digitals tend to want to brighten up those dark areas. Like in this photo, a big center of the photo is dark, and the camera is considering that in its metering, and it overlightened the photo in the first shot. So I go right to a full stop dark and keep that sky right where I want it. Now, I'm not a post-processor. I would catch a lot of flack on this image because my rock is black or very, very dark. For me, being an old school slide and film shooter, this is what I would have seen then. This is pretty much what my eye sees when the sun is in my face. So I'm very happy to let it go silhouette. I actually prefer that. But overall, by darkening the image, I tend to get a little more color, a little more contrast, a little more pop out of it. On my 5D Mark III, the go-to setting, what I call my 0 on exposure compensation, is -2/3. That's my starting point. On my 5D SR, it is -1/3. That is my 0 and my starting point. Another great question.
And then, did you use any filter on the lower portion of this photo?
Nope, no filter at all. Just a 2-stop hard on top.
And why do you use such a small aperture instead of using neutral density filter and an aperture which will give you less diffraction?
Another great question. So there's many ways to think about how you obtain depth of field. Post-processors now, a big thing to do is focal blend, so you can get outside of the camera's limitations. For an old school photographer, there's 2 schools of thought on this. So first I'll tell you what we call the lens sweet spot. The lens sweet spot is not f20 or f22. If I wanted to obtain the sharpest picture in the center of the picture on the particular lens I was using for this shot, that might have been f11 or f13. But I am not trying to create the sharpest image in the middle of my photo. I'm trying to create the best sharpness overall from start to back, from my foreground to my background. So I do give up a little bit of sharpness in the center of the photo over what my sweet spot would be, and the corners of my image might fall off a little bit, a little soft, you might say. But for my style of photography, it's much more pleasing to me to gain that long exposure through the small aperture. That goes back to just kind of the beginning of time with cameras when it was a box with a pin in it. That tiny little hole back in the day created the best image. And in my personal opinion, not being a post-processor, this is how I create my best in-camera work, not only from creating the biggest depth of field, but from allowing the camera to take a longer exposure. Now, had I gone at f11 and I wanted a longer exposure, I could have put a density filter over that. But density filters, solid filters, can at times alter the color of your image, especially when there is a whole lot of color already in the sky. So that's why I wouldn't want to stack another solid filter over this. Another great question, though.
And then a filter question. What is the difference between hard and neutral density?
Oh, they are all neutral densities if you don't pick a color density filter. The difference would be a graduated split neutral density filter or a solid density filter. So the graduated neutral density filter is going to be dark on top, clear on the bottom. And those are going to typically come in hard or soft. And by that, a hard means it's a pretty quick transition from the dark to the light. I prefer hards. A soft filter would transition over a much bigger span of the filter from dark to light. And a soft filter often does not trick the camera into changing its exposure. So when I use soft filters, I often use them in conjunction with a hard filter so I can trick that camera into changing its exposure.
And a lot of your photos, you're doing water and skylines where you have that sort of hard line on the horizon. Does that affect whether or not you choose a hard or a soft filter?
It sure does. And when we get farther into the slideshow, you're going to see where I didn't have the blessing of a very hard line, and you're going to learn how I finesse the filters to overcome that.
Okay, great.
All right, on to another beach photo here. This is Shai Beach, also an Olympic National Park. This adds some great foreground that I love, which is a petroleum creek, which is flowing out into the surf there. I am trying to capture a little bit of reflection of light out there to add some light to the scene. Again, you'll see my sea stacks have gone black in silhouette, which is very typical for my style of shooting. F22, a half a second exposure, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 40 millimeters on my focal, white balance at 6000 K in that go-to landscape roll of film with a simple 3-stop hard on top. Very typical of what I would find out on the beach a lot of times if I'm not doing what I call chasing surf. It's just to back off the sea stacks a little bit and try to find something for its foreground. One thing I love about this particular beach is it is a hiker-only beach, and you get to backpack in and camp on it, which I absolutely love. And you never know, I'm planning a trip here. Hopefully, coming up this Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I may be out camping on this beach again.
Beautiful.
All right, we'll just, oh, and by the way, I'll just throw this out. This particular image did get the cover of Nature Photographer magazine. All right, we'll move on here. Now, this is the same night, and I wanted to show an image, what I call staying out well after sunset. A lot of people leave too early, and they miss some really dynamic photos with a little less color in the sky. So we would call this in the mountains kind of afterglow. On the beach, or alpenglow. On the beach, we might just call it afterglow. And you can see by my technique that it was much, much darker outside. This was shot at f/18 and is a 30-second exposure, 1/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 45 millimeters on the focal length, white balance at 5000 K in my landscape roll of film. I really wanted to retain that nice blue tone in the top of the sky, so I kept my white balance a little lower. And at this time of the night, the light is getting much more balanced. So you don't need as much filter in the sky because there's not as much color in the sky. And that's why you can see I only had to use a 1-stop hard in this image here.
Okay. And then do you use DPPN camera, and is that available in the Canon 62 or 72 or just the 5D?
Oh, the Canon DPP Digital Photo Professional is for all Canons. If you were a Nikon shooter, you would have Nikon's own software, which used to be called Nix or whatever they have now. That's what you'd use as an in-camera shooter. Sony has its own software. Panasonic has its own software. So I use this software simply to convert the images from a RAW file to a usable file, like a TIFF, a JPEG, a PNG, PSD, whatever file you like to do. You would just convert it in the software that came with the camera. Then if you do like to go touch up your images, you could save all your in-camera work with that little move and then open it in Photoshop, Lightroom, or wherever else you want to go do and touch up your photos. And like I said, there is nothing wrong with post-processing your images. I highly support any of my students who still want to touch them up and do it. My goal is to get my students so close to that finished image that they may not even want to do that. But for many photographers, that's part of their fun, and I highly support it. I kind of have this thought about photography. There is no right or wrong way in photography. If what you're doing in your technique makes you happy, then you're doing it right. You're doing it absolutely right. No one can tell you you're doing it wrong. The whole goal is to get out there, shoot your images the way you want them shot, try to convey your spiritual connection, your feeling to that image and the way that you want it conveyed. And it is art, so it is subjective. So some people absolutely hate the color in my photos. Some people love the color in my photos. Some people hate that I do it all in camera. Some people love that I do it all in camera. The fact is, for my own spirit and soul, this is what makes me happy, and this is why I shoot this way.
And then a couple of related questions here. How do you decide which filter to use, one stop versus two, for example, and how do you remember which filters you used when?
Oh, well, the remembering part, I don't know. You know, I may not be able to find my sunglasses on my head, but for some reason I can remember every detail of every photo I've ever shot, and I have no explanation for that. As far as being able to tell which filter to use, it just takes a little practice, but you just put a filter on the top of your photo, and if your sky is too light, you don't have enough filter. So add another filter or replace it with a darker filter. If you get so much filter on top that your foreground is way too bright, you've put on too much filter. The beauty of a digital camera is you can see the results. So with just a few clicks and a few filter adjustments, you should be able to get the right filter. This prospect was much more daunting when we were film shooters, where we actually had to point the camera at the sky and meter, point the camera at the ground and meter, and do some math and hope we're right, slide in that filter and take a picture, and then a week later when you got your slides back, you'd figure out if you were right or wrong. But with a digital camera, you have instant feedback, so just a couple quick filter adjustments, you should be able to get the right filter down. It is something I work intensively on with my first-time sunrise or sunset students, is they struggle with that filter placement and how much filter to put on. But after one good class with me, they got her down, and we move forward.
And I know there are apps for Android and iPhone that will let you track your settings in the camera as well as anything else that you're doing photo by photo. It's gonna take some time, and you'll have to get used to using them. If anyone on here is using one of those apps to track how you're taking your photos and what tools you're using, chime in and let us know what app you're using, and I'll share it with the group.
Yep, and also if anybody didn't know, your camera also records everything you did into it. It doesn't record the filters you used, but it does record your aperture, your shutter speed, your focal length, your white balance, everything, the color palette you used, everything you did besides filters, the camera does internally record that in every image.
And David,
and we're going to move on here to another. Oh, go ahead.
As soon as you switch the image, David said, "Beautiful shot." He likes this one.
All right, I'd love to hear that. This is one more shot from Shy Shy Beach. And I wanted to use this image because I used a solid image in this to extend my shutter speed. So I shot this at f/20, ISO 100. I didn't use any exposure compensation. It was shot at 0. 40 millimeters on the focal, white balance at 5400K in my landscape roll of film. I had a 3-stop hard on the top to balance light between sky and ground, and then a 2-stop solid over the entire image, just because I wanted to smooth out that surf a little more and really let those rocks stick up. And oftentimes when I extend that shutter speed with a density filter, I can pull a touch more color into the image. And again, this is after sunset, so we're kind of seeing the effects of afterglow. And since we've got quite a few to go, I'm just going to jump ahead here. Sunrise and sea stacks from Face Rock Beach and Bandon, Oregon. With that sun coming up behind you, we can get light on those sea stacks, so they shouldn't turn out dark or silhouette. This is one of the images that I had to use a 2-stop soft on. I didn't need a whole lot of light balance. I had good light reflecting in the pools in front of me there, but I did need to darken the sky a little. But my hard filter was showing up in those rocks. After the first click, I saw it. I pulled out the 1-stop hard, slid down a 2-stop soft, and that way you don't see the filter line in the photo.
Okay. We had a couple of people ask, can you tell us which filters you use?
Yes, I carry 11 filters generally in my bag. 1-stop hard, 2-stop hard, 3-stop hard, and 4-stop hard. And then I have a backup 1-stop hard, 2-stop hard, and 3-stop hard in the bag. I also carry a 2-stop solid density filter, a 3-stop reverse density filter, and a 3-stop soft filter. And that's the collection I carry in my little hip pouch that sits on my hip, hanging over my belt while I'm out in the field. If you ever run into me out in the field, you'll see that pouch hanging off my hip there. And occasionally, depending on mood, I change out a filter or two for something I think I might need that night. But that's pretty much my standard filters. And by the way, yep, those are all Singh-Ray filters. To me and my color palette and what my camera shoots, Singh-Ray is the only way to go. Other brands out there like Lee, High Tech, they all have a different tint to them. And for my liking, they don't work well with my camera and my color palette. So Singh-Ray has always been the right call for me. And since I get to teach all different cameras, I believe it's the right call for all my students too. Especially my Nikon shooters. Nikon sensors in camera tend to have a little bit of a yellow-orange tint to them. And if you put another brand filter on it, it highlights that yellow-orange. Whereas a Singh-Ray filter will tone it back down and bring in a little more of those blue pinks, which is really what my students want to see.
And then we did cover the difference between hard and soft, but what is a reverse filter?
Oh, that's a great question, and we're going to get to an image coming up here that's going to have one used in it, and I'll explain more about that then. All right, another shot from Cannon Beach, f/22, 5.2 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 28 millimeters on the focal, white balance 6000K, again in my landscape roll of film. 2-stop hard and a 1-stop hard offset to balance the light here. So I have a 2-stop hard sitting right across the water meets sky line, and I have a 1-stop hard pushed about 2/3 down into the image to just darken up that brighter spot in the sand so that sand right in your foreground didn't turn out too dark. And I love this dappling of the water pools in the sand. It makes for a really good compositions, and boy, I shot a whole mess of them this day. I just picked a more open composition so you could see the whole scene.
And then all of these images that you've shown so far are landscape layout, but you said they use them on a magazine. Do you shoot some that are portrait layout, or do they crop the landscape photos?
Oh, sometimes they crop the landscape photos, as in the Shy Beach photo I pointed out that was on the cover. But I have a rule. For a professional photographer, always keep in mind, or the up-and-coming amateur there, calendars like horizontals, magazines prefer verticals. So if you've got a good scene, a good composition, shoot both of them, because there's probably going to be a use for both of them. And a little tip about getting magazine covers, they often want to put words over the top. So sometimes I will shoot what I call a pour composition and add a little bland sky in the top if I think it's a good candidate for a magazine cover. If you push your composition all the way up to the top of the image, they don't have anything to put text over. So even though it might be a striking image, it might not be suitable for a magazine cover. Just a little pro tip there.
Right. And how do you handle the noise in the dark sections when you're shooting such long exposures?
By leaving them dark. If you go into shadow and highlight and try to pull the shadows there, that's not going to work. So because I don't post-process, I leave them dark. These dark areas, if you were in my gallery right now, I have many 40 by 60 big format gallery wrap canvas and other types of images, and the dark areas print just fine. But if you try to lighten up and recoup those shadows, yep, you're going to see a little fall apart in them, unless you're a post guy and you've either done a series of HDRs or a blending or targeted shooting for those specific dark areas. But me, I like my dark areas dark, so I don't try to repair them. All right, and here's a simple sunset from Cannon Beach. I call this Colors Reflected in the Sand, Cannon Beach, Oregon. This is simply just balancing light, top to bottom, and using a little bit of the designs in the sand to start off the composition. Very simple, f/20.3 seconds, 1 full stop dark, ISO 100, 24 millimeters on the focal, white balance 5600K, and a 2-stop hard. A very simple image to make, all in camera. All you need to do is add a little bit of color.
And Laura, who works for Singh-Ray, chimed in real quick on the hard and soft filters. This is her explanation. Hard is where half the filter is a solid density, and then the transition line is a hard line. Soft is darkest at the top and then slowly graduated towards the center, and reverse is hardest in the center. And
That's a great point. All right, we're going to bump another slide here. Sunset from Hasita Head Lighthouse, Oregon coast. You still with me, Michelle?
I am. Can you hear me?
Okay, there you are.
Okay.
This is shot at f/20. It's a quarter of a second, 2/3 of a stop dark as usual. You'll start to realize my settings are often quite the same. ISO 100, focal length 28 millimeters, white balance 6000K. In that landscape roll of film, I generally shift over to other rolls of film when I'm not shooting sunrise and sunsets, but the landscape is my go-to roll for a Canon. And because I have a strange lines in here, I had to use a soft filter. And as she was explaining that this starts out dark on top, but immediately starts to graduate, it was the perfect fit for this particular image. So you don't see a hard line through that lighthouse. This is an image I'm very proud of. It's not an easy shot to shoot a lighthouse for an all-in camera shooter. And I ended up being able to pull off, not only getting the light pretty balanced, but capturing that light right in your face from the lighthouse and nailing a sun star off the glass from the setting sun made it real special. This is shot in January. On the West Coast, the sun is setting so much farther south, it offers this great light, which caused all those cliffs to glow there in the background. And they have since refurbed this lighthouse. They've taken down those 2 trees that you have in the front of the lighthouse there. And so the lighthouse is stark white now and doesn't look anything like this particular photo. So that's one of those captured moments that can't be repeated.
And this just goes along with the question we had way at the beginning. Let me find it now. Going back, you guys have been really vocal, so now I can't find the question. How do you get those sun rays? Are you shooting in the AM or the PM? And how do you get like the sunburst and the rays coming out of it?
Oh, great question. Well, there's definitely 2 different schools of thought on that. One, using a very small aperture helps you capture the sun star, like f/22 or f/20. This one, it just happens to be busting off the glass there, but say we have a setting sun and it's just tapping the horizon. If you get that setting sun where it's just tapping that horizon and you have a very small aperture and a single shot, you can get a nice sun star or sun rays coming off of it. I believe most of the post processors would tell you a series of images might be better, like an HDR or something, because you can get away with opening the aperture possibly, but you may still want a very small aperture to create that effect. But you can capture them on many different things. You can line a tree up, get the sun halfway into a tree, and capture a great sun star off it. You'll see a beach image coming up where I captured one on the side of a rock. Or you can capture it when the sun's going down on the horizon. Atmospheric conditions also have a little bit to play in that. They're definitely a little harder to capture correctly for an in-camera shooter, I will tell you that. Some of my pro buddies that do Photoshop seem to have a much easier time of capturing a good sun star while the sun is still up in the sky. As an all-in-camera shooter, I don't have any luck with that at all. I need that sun to touch another object before it starts to work for me. Otherwise, I am full of lens flare all over my image. All right, and here's the image I was talking about, just so happens with a nice sun star in there. This is a sunset on the Wizard's Hat from Face Rock Beach, kind of a famous rock here on the West Coast. Lots of photographers like to come out and shoot this guy. This was also another image I captured off the 5D Mark IV. F/20, 1 second, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 24 millimeters on the focal, white balance 5500K in the landscape roll of film. So here we go, 3-stop reverse density and a 1-stop hard offset in this image. So the reverse density has a very dark line right in the center that feathers out towards the top and acts like a regular hard split on the bottom. And when the sun is in my face right there in this type of position, I like to pull that reverse density right into there. Singh-Ray also makes a strip filter that would work good in this same type of situation. But the 3-stop reverse was not quite enough to balance my light from top to bottom there, from sky to pool. So I also had to slide a 1-stop hard over it, and I pushed it a little farther down so it came down in through that surf too, because my first image, that surf was extra bright. And so I was able to really get a more balance throughout this image with that. And this is just a special kind of situation where it looks like you're totally overcast and not going to have any sunset at all. By the way, never give up on a sunset. And then at the last minute, those clouds, that horizon just pulls those clouds away a little, and that sun pops right through, and I just happened to be right there waiting for it. It worked out.
And then a couple of people have asked, what is the offset filter?
It's not a filter. It is offsetting the line on the 2 filters. So whenever I say offset, the split neutral density filter, literally I pushed it right down till it was into that sun. The 1-stop filter, I pushed beyond that. I offset it from the other filter. So it landed at the bottom of that wizard's hat rock. So they were offset just by 1/4 of an inch. And that sometimes makes all the difference.
So as an example, if you had 2 filters that were square, you would hold them together, but one would be vertically 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch higher than the other one. They wouldn't be laying completely flat against each other.
Exactly. You wouldn't have those 2 lines meeting. You'd have them offset. I call it finessing the filters, or creating like a medium. Instead of a hard or a soft, I've created something in between.
Okay. And then on time, we're just about 10 to the hour.
Okay, we're going to speed up here. I'm just going to show you a few images, and then we'll have some questions at the end. Winter sunrise over the Touche Range with Mount Rainier. I winter camped to capture images like this. This is using that 2-stop reverse again right over the sun, and a 2-stop hard over that. And this was a shot taken right before that sun star popped up. In order for me to shoot images like this, it often requires winter backpacking. To be out in the field in that is a little harder than the normal out in the field backpack. This one I used a 2-stop hard and a 1-stop soft, or excuse me, 1-stop hard offset again, meaning they weren't set to the exact same line. This is a winter sunset from Mount Rainier National Park. You see the low clouds out there in the distance, and the sun has come up over those, but it's coming up through some higher clouds out on the horizon. I love this image because it almost makes the snow look like sand. And there was a 3-stop hard and a 1-stop hard, again, offset in this image to make that filter line disappear. Here's a little winter alpenglow with the hoarfrosted trees. And in order not to have a filter line show up in the trees, I used a 3-stop soft. So you wouldn't see the line, but I was still able to get a little light balance between sky and ground. And here is the setup I use in order to winter camp. So my tent's in the foreground, my buddy's tent's in the background, and we have also backpacked in what we call our cabin with a couple of propane heaters. This is how you survive out there. No filters used in this picture. I showed it so you know how I winter camp to get those winter images. This is shot at f4. It's a 1 hour and 10-minute exposure at ISO 100. And you can walk right into a star photo. I walked into my tent. My buddy walked into his tent. We lit them for 30 seconds with your headlamp. You can see me in that first tent. And then we went and sat in the cabin tent for an hour and then lit it for 30 seconds and then walked back through the scene and ended that exposure. This is a winter scene from Crater Lake National Park using a 2-stop hard and a 1-stop hard offset again. So trying to blend out that filter line. This was also one of the few images I did capture with that Mark IV. Another shot of Crater Lake there. We'll just skip right on over this, speed this up a little bit.
We did have a question about sun rays in a forest. How do you capture the sun rays coming through a forest?
Ooh, you know, the forest filters the light, making it much, much easier. I think just with a little practice, you will figure out how to do it. And if you use a tree to actually block the sun itself, you can cause those sun rays sometimes. Just move your camera slightly right or left of a tree until you're blocking that sun, and just some of the rays can escape from it. And here we got up on the screen a winter camp. Again, this is in Crater Lake National Park, but you can see the same kind of setup was used, and this is how you make it a little more comfortable. And there's a winter scene with Mount Shuksan. This shot at f20, 2-second exposure, negative 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, white balance 5400K with a 2-stop hard on top. And this was shot on the same night, just looking in another direction there, same technique. Little longer exposure though, because it's gotten a little darker in the sky. As you can see that blue line coming up to push out alpenglow and go into blue hour. And this was a shot looking yet another direction on the same trip, but this was sunrise, light hitting Mount Baker. And there you've got the first skiers up in the morning, and they're looking up at us at our camp thinking we're crazy for staying up there. I would say the temps hit wind chills negative 20 that night, and probably one of the coldest nights of my life. And there you go. There's that sunburst through the trees. And I did a little positioning here until I had that sun star coming right through one of the small holes in that tree. This one worked out real good because it literally looks like it's burning right through the tree. My first shot, my sky was a little bright, so I pushed a 2-stop soft filter over the sky to help kind of balance out that light. And luckily, by just moving around, I was able to stick with this shot for a good 5 minutes. I just kept putting in a different hole in the tree as the sun kept progressing up the sky. Now, sometimes if the light ain't right for color, I love to shoot it in camera black and white. Perfect situation for that. Little light hitting the mountain, little light coming through that fog, a 2-stop hard and a 1-stop hard offset to balance that light for this bad boy. And we only got a couple slides left here. I'll speed right through them. This is sunrise reflected over Badwater, Death Valley National Park. The special thing about this is Badwater rarely ever actually gets water in it. And I had my students out teaching in Death Valley when we shot this shot. And this was with a 3-stop hard and a 2-stop solid over the entire image, just to lengthen that shutter speed a little bit, capture a tiny bit of movement in those clouds, and add a touch of color to this scene. And here's one of my favorite spots in the desert, the Mesquite Sand Dunes in Death Valley. A nice little lenticular cloud built there on the right of the image. 2-stop hard and 1-stop hard, again offset to make that filter line disappear. Standard settings, f20, 3.2 seconds, 2/3 of a stop dark, ISO 100, 55 millimeters on my focal, white balance at 5400K in that good old landscape roll of film. And there I am out in the field. This is a self-portrait. I did take the shot, but I did borrow my buddy's camera to pose in front of, so he tells me his camera needs to give me a model release to actually use this photo here. And there's a little information about me. If you ever wanted to find out more about me or my lessons, you could just jump on my website there. And I'd also like to just mention I have a new book out called Images of the West, which is 20 years of my photography, all in camera, all old school style. And let's open up the floor there for some questions.
Sure. And I did post some links as he was talking in the chat window. I posted a link to the Singh-Ray website. If you still have questions as far as hard and soft and reverse, there's a lot of different terminology there. If you go to the Singh-Ray website and you look at the different products, we have pictures of the different models, the hard and the soft versus the reverse and the regular and the solid. So I posted a link there. I posted another link specifically to a reverse filter because a couple of people had asked about that. And I think it's just easier to look at it and then you'll get it. And then we had a lot of comments on the third to last images. I think it was the Death Valley one. Terry says, wow. Dennis said, phenomenal. Bill said, nice shot. So we got a lot of compliments there. Loving that that picture there where the water was in the valley.
Oh, thank you very much. I sure appreciate that. And boy, that was a real treat for all my students to get to actually shoot that. I love it when I'm out in the field and magic happens for all my students.
Yeah. And then on the lighthouse, it had areas that are very red. Can you comment on that?
Yes, that is just that glowing sun. The sun is just about to go down. Now, there has been a trend in photography and post-processing to take less colorful images. I'm not a supporter of that particular trend. I think if the color's there, you have to capture it. If I was a post-processor during that image and I shot a HDR or a series of images or I blended, that would have probably been blended out. But for an all-in-camera shooter shooting longer exposures, that's one of the side effects that I love about that style of photography. But the red in the image literally is that sun just about to go down. And we call it kind of golden hour, but it gets more and more intense. But great question.
Right. And then a couple of people wanted to know, how do you keep from scratching your lenses when you're changing them out? And then how do you protect them? What kind of case?
That is a great question. I use a low pro filter pouch. It's called Filter Pouch 100. It holds a dozen of those filters in them. So you don't have to keep them in their protective cases or covers. You can just put them in there. I'm not afraid to run my filters underwater especially after a beach shoot, because you get that kind of salty beach, I don't even know what you call it on there. And Singh-Ray makes a great product to clean your filters with. It's not a glass cleaner, it's meant for filters. I love using that product. My students love it too. But in keeping them safe and not getting them scratched, the best thing you can do before you put them away is to make sure there is no dust or dirt on them. I'm not going to nitpick when the magic is happening. I need to use them. If there's a piece of dust or something, I'm not going to stop to clean it. But I do always take time to make sure I've dusted them off before I slide them back into my pouch. And after a good long trip, I always take all the filters out of the pouch, clean them all, and then I actually take the pouch apart and clean it to make sure there's no dirt, grit, or grime in there. The fact of the matter is, you buy these to use them, and they need to be out in the field used, and you may scratch them a time or two. If they're scratched bad enough, you'll have to replace it. But hopefully you captured so many amazing images with it that you feel justified. You earn that scratch. But with just a little bit of care, they actually hold up pretty darn good, and they're pretty durable.
It was a good note on the cleaner that Singh-Ray makes is called Ray View. It's RAY-VU. And in addition to being a cleaner, it actually does leave a little film on there, which is it is some protection for your filter. So check out on the website. It's not very expensive at all, and it's definitely worth carrying around with you.
I would definitely say that. And I'd also like to add, so I don't forget, if you go on Singh-Ray's website, they have the pro blogs on there. And also some of the pros like me have a pro gallery on there. If you wanted to continue to learn more about the use of these filters, my first 3 blog posts on there were about all-in-camera photography and the use of these filters. So you could read through that also and get more tips and techniques for using these filters correctly.
Right. And then Laura wanted me to make sure I let you know if you need more information or if you want to speak to someone, you want advice on filters or protection or any of that, give us a call at Singh-Ray, and we'll be happy to help you. So they're on the East Coast and they work hard, and they are very excited to hear from customers. So they'd love to hear from you. And then we had a couple of people say, how do you create that landscape film?
Okay, that is a very good question, and my blog post on Singh-Ray can help explain it a little more. But I'm just going to use Canon to make it simple. All the cameras have similar settings. Some of the cameras, it's called Creative Style. Nikon, it is called Picture Control. For Canon, it's called Picture Styles. And if you go into your Picture Styles in your Canon, you will notice these presets: standard, monochrome, landscape, portrait, neutral, faithful, and some Canons even just have a 1, 2, and 3 that you can assign whatever you want to it. So each one of these is a different color palette in the camera straight out of the box. The only problem is if you don't set them up, your camera is only pushing about 20% of its color. Now, for post-processors out there, they don't want any color in their photo. They're going to add all this later in their own style and their own techniques. But for us in-camera shooters, it is critical that we actually give the camera a color palette. So if your camera will prompt you, say you go to your landscape roll of film, often in a Canon, if you look at the bottom, it'll say hit your info button or display button. If you hit that button, the internal part of that roll of film will pop up. You'll see sharpness. Some of the Canons have multiple sharpnesses you can set, like strength, thickness, and threshold. You can set your contrast, you can set your saturation, and you can set your color tone. On Canons, I don't really set the color tone too much. A couple of my rolls of film I do, that I'm looking for a specific look. On Nikons, some of my students like a little more adjustment, so they adjust the color tone. You can also go one step further and do what we call an advanced sensor shift, and actually shift the color tone of your sensor. If you pull that up, it looks like a graph that has blue and pink tones on the bottom and yellow and orange tones on top, and you can just pull your whole sensor tone towards one of those color palettes. I don't need to do that with Canons. I'm very happy with the color palette, but a lot of my Nikon students who are seeing too much yellow-orange in their sensor will pull that sensor shift down towards the blue-pink to try to mimic a little bit more of what's out of a Canon. And some of my Nikon shooters love their yellow sensor tone, so that's a personal preference. But in a very kind of dumbed down version, that is how you access those color controls inside your camera. And just remember in saying that, if you're shooting in RAW, that means you're going to have to open that photo in the software that came with the camera. Otherwise, those controls disappear. You will not see those effects if you open your RAW file in Photoshop.
And then, do you prefer circular or square filters?
As far as the split neutral density, the solid density, and the reverse density filters, in my opinion, they have to be rectangular. They have to be square filters. If you get a screw-on round filter, that's going to put your horizon line right in the center of your picture, and your composition is going to have to be based off of your filter. With the square or rectangular filters, you can slide those up and down to match your composition. Your filter should never dictate composition. Your eye should. As far as polarizers, I definitely prefer a screw-on circular polarizer, not a filter that you would slide into a holder. So I need to have my filter in that fashion screw onto the camera.
And then the Mesquite Death Valley, was that a sunrise shot?
That was a sunset shot. And that's when I do teach in Death Valley, that is always one of my students' favorite shots because you can shoot both directions over those dunes. And that's a little bit of a secret spot for me. That's a hard one to find when you're out walking those dunes. But when you walk those dunes, you find your own secret spots. But magic often happens out in those dunes.
Right. And in general, how many test shots does it take to get to your favorite image?
Ooh, boy, that is a loaded question. If I'm shooting what I call a stagnant light scene, like a forest scene on an overcast day, and I'm not including any sky, I'm just down in the forest or I'm down shooting a waterfall, no sky involved, I would say 2. And with some practice, you can certainly get to that. I shoot the first shot, I already know all the settings I'm going to like for that scene. All I need to know is if I've got it too light or too dark. So I shoot the first shot. If it's light or dark, I darken or lighten it. Second shot's in the bank. And by the way, that's the catchphrase I use is, pow, nailed it, that's in the bank. For a sunrise or sunset shot, it may take a couple of more shots because you have to get that filter balance down also. Not only do you have to get the exposure, the white balance, the roll of film or color palette right, but you also have to get the balance of that filter down. So if I'm lined up for a good sunset, I have the composition I want, I'm solid on my composition, I might go through 4 or 5 test shots to get the filters right for that time. And then I pretty much can stand there and wait for light to go. And if I'm really happy with the composition, I won't even bother to move my camera. I'll just shoot all the way through a sunrise or sunset. But as the light comes up or gets lower, you'll have to adjust your filters, less filter or more filter. So,
and that one where you sacrificed your boots and you went into the water, we had a couple of questions. How far do you go in the water? Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, I only went a few steps out there, but I made those steps when the surf was heading out. When the one I caught with that shot hit me, that one only came up to maybe my knees, but I was so happy with the first shot. I'm like, oh, now I'm committed. And I stood there, and when the second wave hit me, almost knocked me down. So yeah, there's a little concern there. I may have put a little care to the wind, too wrapped up in what I was doing. But I loved it. I loved every minute of it, and I was freezing the whole hike back to my hotel. But all I need to do is look at my shot, and it warmed me right up.
Okay, and then a couple of people asked about the 4x6 filters and will they fit in the Lee system? And yes, all four 100 by 150 millimeter, 100 by 100 size filters will fit in the Lee holder. So that's
absolutely.
And I'm not sure which image. I think it's the one where you went in the water, but pretty soon after that, someone asked, how do you avoid darkening the hillside?
That's that question I was trying to answer. When you have an uneven background out there, that's when I do the 2 filter trick instead of 1, where I offset 2 filters so their dark lines don't show up on the same plane. And I can push one almost touching the mountains, and then I can push one into the mountains. And generally, I can get those filters to disappear. That does take, I call it finessing the filters again, and it just takes a little practice. But you can get very good at adjusting your filters, switching from a hard to a soft, or adding a soft over a hard. And with just a little bit of practice, you can get very, very good at it. Most of my students who take one of my one-day classes get fairly good at it, but they still say they struggle at times. And if they come out for one of my multi-day classes, a 5 or 10-day class, by the end of that, I'd consider them masters of the filter. I no longer need to school them or help them. They seem to get the filter lines just right, disappeared, and good balanced image.
All right. And then what is the single biggest upside and downside to using filters?
Single biggest upside is when you do the work in the camera. This is my own opinion, and there's way more opinions than mine, but when you can get your filters right in the camera, you will pick up more color. When you're balancing the image on the spot, you're really trying to get what your eye sees or enhance what your eye sees on the spot. The use of filters and balancing that light affords the camera a more balanced exposure in one shot. So you can do that. And the upside to being an all-in-camera photographer, like I said, is the joy of seeing that finished image in the back of the camera. Often when I'm out in the field shooting and people are walking by, if I'm on the beach or something, I'll get a crowd around my camera, pointing at my camera. And they're yelling at people, come over here and look at this image. Oh my God, come look at this picture. And that just is so exciting that people like my work right in the camera so much that they want their friends to come over and have a look too. I would say the downside is there are some situations where it's just impossible to balance the light in the camera, where you might have way too many shadows, way too erratic of a horizon out there, the wrong kind of angle on the sun coming in. Very good post-processors can overcome those challenges. For me, I call that an image just for viewing, not for shooting. So that would be one of the downsides. The other downside, if I was all of a sudden a post-processor talking to you, I would point out all the dark images in my own work here. From not post-processing, from not using highlight and shadow, from not doing multiple image blending or HDR or masks or all the other tricks that are out there. This is my personal opinion though. Sometimes photos are so over-processed, they lose their color and they lose the magic of the moment. Technically, they are perfect in every corner. They're sharp. It's unbelievable in all these corners, but there's something to be lost in the in-camera image. For me, I guess the best comparison is there is some music that just doesn't sound as good on an MP or a CD as it does on the old LP vinyl. There's some magic lost. That's just my own personal opinion. I love the magic of an in-camera image, but that doesn't mean that I don't follow a whole bunch of post-processors who I think do magical work, because I certainly do, and there's certainly a good viable reason to go the other route. I will say this about being an all-in camera shooter as a professional. Since I don't post-process my images, I'm able to give my publishers and my stock agencies way more images every year. They receive over 2,000 images from me a year. If I even post-process those images for 1 hour, that is more physical time than there is in the year. Maybe I could give them 200 images. So that's one of my secrets to getting published. And in my gallery, when I show people the back of my camera, when they can't believe I've done all this work in the camera and I've shown them the back of the camera, they're sold. They buy stuff right off the wall. So there is a group of people who just love it that I do it all in camera. And then there's a whole bunch of group of photographers that hate it because of all the downfalls they can find in my images that I could have post-processed out.
Right. And then using these filters, are you usually filtering the top of the image?
Almost always, but the very first image I put up was of Mount Adams. When I balanced, I had a filter on top and an upside filter on the bottom because I had a reflection and I needed light in the center of the image. The beauty of using a filter system is you can turn those filters any direction you want. If you're in a canyon and light's coming down into half of the canyon, there's a solid dark line of shadow coming down. You can just turn that filter system to match that shadow line and put as many filters on as it takes to balance that light. So it's very versatile. And if you, like I said, if you learn to finesse those filters, you can use them in all kinds of crazy ways. Singh-Ray developed a filter just for me. And had it been in part of this talk, I might have brought it up, but I like to call it the Randall J Hodges Mountain V filter. The dark area is actually shaped like a V. For when I run into a situation where I can't get a straight filter to balance it. And I just got this filter, and while I was teaching my fall color class, I got to pull out the Mountain V filter because that exact situation came up, and I showed all my students it. Their minds were just blown away. So coming up in the future here, they've got a blog post of mine they're going to post up here pretty soon on the website. But I'm going to do a blog post about that Mountain V filter just for that crazy situation.
That sounds really cool. If you're just starting out, what 2 or 3 filters would you recommend people start with?
Oh, this is a great question. And this is what, if you were to take one of my more than 1 day sunset courses, this is exactly what you would need to come to my class. A 1-stop, a 2-stop, and a 3-stop filter in hard graduation. And I will just say, for starting out, that will handle 95% of all situations you get into. You'll be very, very happy with them for a very long time. And then there will be a time when you master them to the point where you notice you need a couple more filters. And but to start with, the 1, 2, and 3-stop in hard graduation means you can stack a 3 and a 2 together and have 5 stops. You can stack a 3 and a 1 together and have 4 stops. And you can stack all 3 together and have 6 stops of light. And that gets you through most of those situations. Great question.
Yeah. And then a couple of questions about your gear. What is the total weight of your camera gear, including your tripod and filters? And do you have any tips on using tripods in where you've got salt water and salty air?
Oh, a couple of great questions there. My gear ranges depending on the lens I have in my bag. I generally, because I'm a hiker, only want to carry one lens, which is my 24 to 105. So my camera gear weighs in between 11 and 13 pounds with a tripod. And since I'm a big hiker, that means my day pack generally starts around 33 pounds, but I've also got clothes and food and water and survival stuff in there. And then my backpack starts in right around 45 pounds. Including my camera gear, and then you can add 3 pounds a day for food beyond that. So for me, a 6-day hike is a 70-pound pack, and that is crushing. But that's how I get to some more remote locations, and that's one of my secrets to my success is just out hiking everybody else. And then the other question, what was the other? Oh, tripod in the surf.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a problem. It's also a problem when you're in the desert with sand. And what I recommend is when you're done with the shoot, preferably every day if it's possible, you extend your tripod legs out, not so far out that the internal pieces come out, but extend it all the way out and just wash it off. Most tripods can handle that, no problem. But if you leave the salt water on there, it will corrode some of the metal components of the tripod. A lot of us shoot carbon fiber, and they can handle that pretty darn good. But I do try to take care to extend, and you'll get a grit in there. You'll feel the grit all over in your tripod. So extend those legs out, wash them off, hose off the whole tripod. I also will lay my tripod on the ground and just loosen the legs, whatever's holding the legs, if it's a screw or if it's a click lever, and just open that up and let some water get up inside there and rinse that out. I don't recommend pulling the tripod leg all the way out because you may not be able to put those shoes back together and get them in there very easily. But this is pretty effective for me, and I can get most of the grit out. I've been shooting the same tripod for the last 5 years, and it's been in the surf more times than I can count, and it's still out there kicking butt.
Yeah. And then one of our audience members wrote in, Boyd says, really right stuff. He used to have a write-up on their website about cleaning your tripod. So if you want to go look and see if that's still there. And then do you make a lot of use of the histogram on your camera, or do you just go off what you're seeing in this screen?
Oh, another good question. For my post-processing buddies, they're all about the histogram. And if they're shooting more images, I swear some of my buddies don't even hardly look at what they're shooting. They just look at the histogram, one on the dark, one in the middle, one on the high side, or even more images than that. For me, if you come to my class, I'm going to ask you to turn off your histogram. I don't want it guiding your photo whatsoever. For an in-camera shooter, we got to use our eye. And because there's no right or wrong way in photography, it's really a personal preference how light or dark you like your image. So to get my students to train their eye, I prefer they do not use their histogram at all. But that, I would say on the other end of photography, on the post-processing end, the histogram is a hugely important tool. So it's just depending on what side of the fence you're kind of shooting on there.
Okay. And then for star trails, why do you do a single shot rather than a series of shots? Doesn't that add noise?
Another great question. Again, as an all-in camera shooter, and I'm a little rigid about my own personal rules, which I do not hold my students to or anybody else to. This would require post-processing to put those images together. So that in itself knocks it out of my realm. And for a long exposure, yes, on a short exposure, a single exposure for a star photo, if you have to push that ISO too high, you're going to get noise. No doubt about it. For a long exposure, if you turn on your long exposure noise reduction, you should see very little or no noise. I can blow my long exposure star photos up to 40 by 60s with no problem, no noise whatsoever. But a warning about that. If you shoot a 1 hour star photo and you've got your long exposure noise reduction on, it's going to take your camera 1 hour to process it. So highly recommended pro tip, start with a fresh battery, because if that dies in the processing part of it, if your battery dies, you will lose your image. And on my 5D Mark III, I'm able to stack a series of short star photos, then take a long star photo, and then maybe stack 1 or 2 short star photos. And I don't mean put together. I mean, I can just keep shooting. But all that time has to be added up. If I shot 3 30-second photos and then a 1 hour photo and then 2 30-second photos, it's going to have to process 1 hour. What did all that? Basically 1 hour and 2 or 3 minutes. And if it dies on that last 30-second photo, I lose them all. So fresh battery is the key to that.
Okay. Looking through, we've got a few more still. Someone said, I see you use, as an example, 5200K, etc. Any particular comments you have on the K?
Practice. If you want to be an all-in camera shooter, you're going to have to master your white balance. I tell my students in their my beginning students, to set their cameras to 6000K. And I tell them, if for some reason you forget you've done this, you're probably going to be pretty happy 80% of the time. But white balance needs to be practiced and mastered. When I shoot a star photo, my white balance is much, much lower. If I'm shooting a Milky Way shot, I might be at 4,000 K. If I'm shooting a long exposure, I might be anywhere between 3,200 K and 5,000 K. If I'm shooting a city light photo and I want my, in what we call blue light or blue hour, I want my sky to be blue, my white balance has to be adjusted so it's blue and not yellow. If you're shooting just a standard blue sky photo and you've got some nice puffy white popcorn clouds out there, and those clouds are yellow, your white balance is too hot. You've heated that photo up too much and it needs to be lowered. If you're shooting that same photo and your clouds have a bluish gray tone, not a white, the white tone you're seeing, you've got your white balance too low and you need to boost that guy up a little bit. So that's why I recommend you practice 3 shots. In K, shoot a shot at 5,000 K, 6,000 K, 7,000 K, and then figure out which one was the closest to your liking, and then fine tune it. Maybe you liked 6,000 K, but the real answer is 5,700 K. With a little practice, you can get that down. If you only have symbols in your camera, you would do sunny, cloudy, and shady, which represent 5,200 K, 6,000 K, and 7,000 or 7,200 K. So you would shoot those 3 photos and then you determine which one of those was your favorite. And pretty soon, you're going to start to realize where your camera's starting point is. And you're going to leave it set to that starting point. And every time you get it out, that will be your first shot. And then you'll fine tune your white balance on your second shot.
Okay, and then someone asked about videos on Singh-Ray, and we don't have a lot of video on the website, but we do have a YouTube channel, and if you search Singh-Ray on YouTube, you'll probably come across some videos by photographers as well as videos that have been produced by Singh-Ray ourselves. So definitely check out YouTube if you're looking for videos.
Oh, and I can chime in there for a second if I may.
Yeah.
If you go to my website at randalljhodges.com, right on the home page, one of the links is Out in the Field with Randall J Hodges. That is a video series I shoot. And if you watch one of those latest videos, they run about 6 or 7 minutes long. I'll take you on a little journey out in the field. You'll see me use these filters out in the field. You'll actually see the back of my camera and the results I'm getting right in the camera, right on the spot. And you'll see, I'll talk you through which filters I'm using and why, and a bunch of other techniques that may really help you in the use of those filters.
And then do you ever shoot and post-process stitch panoramas?
To be very, very honest, I have only done that once. I shot a series, 3 photos at Crater Lake simply because there was no lens wide enough to capture all of Crater Lake. Those were shot on slide film and scanned and then merged in Photoshop. So that was the only way back in that day that I could capture that image. But if you come in my gallery and see my panoramics, almost all of them are simple crops out of one image. Cameras like the 5D SR at 50 megapixels can shoot such a big image that I'm okay to crop the top and bottom of it off and call it a panoramic. Again, on the post-processing side of the world, they may call that archaic, and that I should have used a 7 vertical pan or something. But like I said, I get no joy from sitting behind the computer. I get all my joy from being out in the field. And the more I'm out in the field, the more images I capture and the more I can send to my publishers and the more chances I have a gallery shot. And to be quite honest, for me, the more money I make as a professional photographer.
We're down to the last couple of questions. I do want to plug in here that we are doing a webinar for Singh-Ray once a month, and we have a different guest presenter every single month. So we've had a couple of suggestions on I'd like to hear about this more, or I'd like to hear about that more. So stay tuned. If you want to find out what's coming up, go to singh-ray.com, singh-ray.com/webinars. Really easy to remember. So go there and it'll show you anything that we have planned coming up, and you can see what the topic is. If we have arranged already for a guest speaker, we'll list there who the speaker is. And so hopefully you'll join us every month, and we'll have different people and different ways of thinking and different techniques, and we can all become better photographers.
And if I could just jump in there, I hope Singh-Ray will invite me back down the road to do one more, because I'd really love to do one on circular polarizers.
Yeah, well, it looks like the audience would be on board with it. Eric says, great webinar. A lot of information was covered. And I feel like I definitely came away with some good ideas. So thank you, Randall and Singh-Ray.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Michael commented that it was very thought-provoking and interesting technique. He liked the webinar, and he would like, Randall, that your branding would be a little better. He wanted your name to be more prominent. So an idea for next time.
Well, I thank you for that, Michael. That I'll take due note of that.
And then he said you should buy a filter for your model who lent you the camera.
Oh, he got paid in that, but it was in beer.
And then Lois said she would like you to do a webinar once a week. And Jeff agrees.
I would do it whenever Singh-Ray wants me to, so you betcha.
Awesome. And then Robert asked about the discount code. We are sending an exclusive discount code out to anyone who registered, whether you're able to attend live or if you're watching it later. You'll get that email later tonight. It'll have the promo code in there. It'll describe which filters it applies to, and all the details will be there. So you'll get that email. If for some reason you don't get that, check your spam filter, or give us a call during the day. Give a call to Singh-Ray during the day. I'll give you their phone number. They're in Florida on the East Coast, and the number is 863-993-4100. If you're on the webinar right now, that means we do have your email address, and you should get that promo code without incident. So if not, just let us know.
There for 1 second, I would also say if you ever come out and take a class with me, and I'm helping you outfit for your class, Singh-Ray graciously extends a 10% discount to my students, so I would give you that coupon code at that time also, so you could enjoy that discount to get yourself into some great filters.
And does Singh-Ray recommend a particular filter holder for their rectangular filters? Laura, you're still on the line, so if you want to answer that, is there a particular folder that, or sorry, a particular holder that Singh-Ray recommends? And we have a vote for the circular polarizer webinar. Thank you.
All right, that's the other half of this puzzle, so I'd really like to do it.
And then another, here's a good one too. Are there special considerations for mirrorless shooters?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. Mirrorless shooters, my recommendation as you update your lenses is to get lenses with a bigger diameter. It makes controlling filters much, much easier. In many ways, shooting a mirrorless camera would be no different than a DSL, a circular polarizer during the day, graduated split neutral density filters for sunrise and sunsets. However, some of the stock lenses that come are so small in the front in diameter, it makes getting that filter balance on there a little bit tough. So a lot of my students who have mirrorless cameras, as they upgrade their lenses, they get in bigger diameter. It's just when you get a better lens, that's just the way it generally goes. And they find, and I find teaching them is much, much easier. So when selecting lenses for your mirrorless, go with a little bigger diameter lens. It'll make a lot of things easier for you.
And then as far as a recommendation for a filter holder, we don't have an official preference. Whatever you choose is fine. We do carry the Koken holder just for convenience, so you can buy it all in one place.
And I highly recommend the Koken holder myself. My second choice would be a Lee holder. But for me, the Koken holder is a little less expensive, and like she said, it's already available on the Singh-Ray site. And if you're taking advantage of one of those discounts, either from me or from Singh-Ray, you can save a little money on it. And the Lee holders work fine, but some of my students struggle with them just a little bit. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Okay. And then what color space do your TIFFs come out in?
Can you ask that question one more time?
What color space do your TIFFs come out in, the TIFF image?
Oh, the stock that came out of the camera. So, and I run an 8-bit TIFF because that's what my printers match. So when I do my raw conversion, I convert into an 8-bit TIFF in standard settings.
Okay. And then one photo program has a raw processing program so that you don't have to use one from your camera to process a raw photo into a JPEG or the format. I'm not
The
sure.
only program that I know that is out there that captures all the in-camera work besides the software that came with the camera would be Lightroom with a plugin. At least for the 5D Mark III, Lightroom had a plugin that basically, when you imported it through the Canon software into Lightroom. I've had my students inform me of that. But really, it's a tough go if you don't want to use that software. And that software that comes with the camera, all you really need to use it for is to convert the file from RAW to another format, to capture all your in-camera work. So that is what I personally recommend. And a lot of the software, like my Canon DPP, is a mirror of your camera. So if you did want to do a little post right in your RAW file, you could change your white balance and see what it would have looked like. You can change what I call that roll of film or color palette. You could lighten or darken your images. You could do almost, not everything, but many things you could do in a Photoshop program. You could do right in your RAW file, right in your Canon DPP software, or your Nikon NIC software, or your Panasonic or Sony softwares.
And I know the most current version of Photoshop will open a RAW file, but I don't know that it has the same capabilities as the Canon program that would open the same file.
No, the problem is, like I explained, if I shoot an in-camera black and white in RAW and I open it in Photoshop, it comes up as a color photo. That is the base RAW file, and that is all Photoshop can see. Photoshop cannot see my white balance, my color palette, and it can't even see that I changed it to a black and white in the camera. So you will lose your in-camera work. If you've ever looked at the back of the camera and thought your image was better than it looks on your computer screen, that is exactly what happened. You passed a RAW file straight into Photoshop or Lightroom and then erased your in-camera work.
Okay, it looks like we've gotten through all of the questions. Randall's information is up on the screen, so if something comes to mind later, you can send him an email directly. If you have questions about Singh-Ray products or need help deciding what to start with, if you're just getting started, or what your next filter should be, give us a call. Singh-Ray is down in Florida on Eastern Time. And then if you wanted to find out, I did post that link about the website. If you want to find out the difference between a hard versus soft, if you want to see the difference between a regular graduated filter versus the reverse graduated filter, check out the Singh-Ray website. It's just sing-ray.com, and there's pictures of all of the products there, and we've got tons of sample photos, so you can see what types of photos you can take with each type of filter. And if there's anything any of us can do to answer questions, just reach out and ask. We would love to hear from you.
Yep, and you guys reach out to me at any time you want. And if you want help learning to use these filters, come out and take a class. I'll take you out in the field and make you a filter master.
That sounds like a lot of fun. So thank you so much, Randall, for being here with us today. We ran long, and I appreciate all that time that you spent with us today. We had great questions, and you had great answers.
Oh, no problem at all. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it a whole lot.
All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. We hope you'll join us next month for our next webinar, and have a great evening.
Have a great evening, everybody. Thanks a lot.